Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel, Nady the Coder. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about optional chaining in objects, what is optional chaining and how we can use it. Before diving into the lectures, please make sure you watch the previous lectures on JavaScript in order to follow along. Let's just dive into the lecture. Optional chaining is a safe way to access nested object properties, even if an intermediate property doesn't exist. So we denote the optional chaining by this sign. You can see the question mark with the followed by the dot. So this is how we denote the optional chaining operator. It's not basically an operator, but a syntax construct. If you just started the tutorial and learning JavaScript, maybe the problem hasn't touched you yet, but it's quite common. Let's take a look into an example. I'll get rid of this code, and let's say we have a user object that's basically empty for now, and let's say we are printing something like this, and we are saying user.address, which does not exist, and we are trying to find out the street of the user from the address object. So basically user object, and then there should be another object that we call address, and then there should be another object that should be a street number, and we can just put anything we want. But since it's just for demonstration purpose, we'll get rid of this for now. And I'll save the file, refresh. So this is, you can see the error over here. Type error cannot read property of undefined reading street. So it's because the address object is undefined, and that's why it returns the error. That's basically the expected result. JavaScript works like this. As user.address is undefined, an attempt to get user.address.street fails with an error. In many practical cases, we would prefer to get undefined instead of an error. But how we can do this? The obvious solution would be to check the value using the f or the conditional operator before accessing the property. So let's say we have a user object like this, and before accessing the street property, we can do something like this. First, we will check if the user.address exists, then go for user.address.street. Otherwise, just return undefined. So here, what we are doing is we are checking if the address exists on the user object, then go for the nested property, that is basically the street. If the address does not exist on the user object, then return undefined. Or we can also do, if you're not very familiar with the ternary operator, we already talked about this in the previous lectures, but if you're still not familiar with this, we can simply do if user.address, then return. We can do something like this. We'll declare a variable just to assign the street number to it. User.address.street. Otherwise, street number should be undefined. So this is one way to do this, but a more cleaner way to do this is basically this ternary operator. And let's say we print the values and see, when we print the value, we'll see that there is no difference in there. So if I print the street number now, in this case, when I refresh, you can see we're getting undefined because the address is not defined. And if instead of doing this, if I simply print this one, I'll still get the same result. You can see it's still undefined. So it really works, and there is no error, but it's quite inelegant. As you can see that the user.address appear twice in the code, and it's pretty redundant. Let's say we have a more deep nested properties in here. For example, we are trying to get the street name out of here. So when in this condition, we'll have to put another condition, a nested condition, and we'll say if user.street exists, then return user.address.street dot, for example, name. Otherwise, return null. So this is, you can see that user.address is repeated 3 times, and if we are going more deeper and deeper, the more redundant our code will be and the more unclear our code will be. This is just awful. One may even have problem understanding such code, and there's a little better way to write it using the AND operator as well. So let's say we have the same user object and we want to access the properties of the street name, but in this time we won't use the turning operator but just the AND operator that we have seen in the previous lectures. So let's say we're checking for the user address, and we said, okay, if the user address exists, then return user.address.street. And for example, if we are checking for the more nested property, for example, the street name, then we'll also have to check for this. So we will first check if the user address exists. If it is true, then go to this block. If this is true, then go to the user.address.street.name. So you can see we still have more redundancy over here. We are repeating the user.address 3 times and it doesn't look very good. So basically ending the whole path to the property ensures that all components exist. If not, the evaluation stops, but also isn't ideal. As you can see, property names are still duplicated in the code. For example, the user.address appears 3 times. That's why the optional chaining was added to the language to solve this problem once and for all. Optional chaining stops the evaluation if the value before this is undefined or null and returns undefined. So I'll get rid of this code over here. So the safer way now to access the user.address.street and the street name is basically to use the optional chaining. So over here, I'll just get rid of this code just to make it clear. So we will first check for the address if the address object exists on the user object first. So for that, we will have to use the optional chaining over here. That's basically the syntax construct. And then we'll check for address. And then we'll check for the street. If the street object exists on the address object, then go for the name. So yeah, you can see how much cleaner it is to use the optional chaining over here. And that was the reason that optional chaining was added to the language. The code is short and clean and there is no duplication at all. Let's make a practical example over here and add some properties over here. For example, I am adding address, and then I'm adding a street, and then I'm adding a name over here. For example, I'll say NY. When I refresh, you can see that I'm getting NY. But let's say it's basically street 1 and not the street. Then what I'll return, then what it will return is basically undefined. So you can see that we are not getting any errors over here, but we're just returning undefined instead of the error itself. So basically in this example, the user.address.street.name allows the user to be safely null or undefined and returns undefined in that case. You should note one thing, that the optional chaining syntax makes optional the value before it, but not any further. So the value before this sign, that would be optional, but not any further. Don't overuse the optional chaining. We should use optional chaining only where it's okay that something does not exist. For example, if according to our code logic, the user object must exist, but address is optional, then we should write user.address, we get rid of this, .street, but not user.address.street. So if we know that some object or the root property must exist or the variable itself must exist, then we don't need to do this necessarily. So we should only make use of the optional chaining for the, then if, for example, if the user happens to be undefined, we will see a programming error about it and fix it. Otherwise, if we overuse the optional chaining, coding errors can be silenced, we are not appropriate, and become more difficult to debug. There is another thing that must be noted, that the variable before the optional chaining must be declared. Otherwise, we will get an error for that. So let's say we are checking for the user object, the address within the user object. So if the user object is not there and we are using the optional chaining, it won't work. So let's say we have this as user1 and we save this, and when I refresh, I'll still get the error. You can see the user is not defined. So in this case, the user must be defined in order to check the nested properties for that. So in simple words, the variable must be declared. The optional chaining works only for declared variables. Short circuiting. The optional chaining immediately stops or short circuits the evaluation if the left part does not exist. If there are any further function calls or operations to the right of the optional chaining, then they won't be made. So that we just saw in this example over here. So we are seeing if the user exists, then we go to the next property. If the address exists, it will go to the next one. If it is null or undefined, then it will stop over here and it won't go further, and it will just return undefined. We also have some other variants of the optional chaining. So the optional chaining is not an operator, but a special syntax construct that also works with functions in square brackets. For example, this syntax, the syntax with the square bracket also works if we would like to use brackets to access properties instead of dot operator in objects. So for example, in here, this syntax is used to call a function that may or may not exist. I'll get rid of this code for now. And let's add a function to the user object. Let's say the function name is hi. And it's just console log or prints a message that says hello world. Let's say we have another object that's called admin, and that's basically an empty object. And on both of the objects, we want to access the same function that's called hi. Let's see how we can do this. So on the user object, we can simply do user.hi. Okay. And also on the admin object, we can do admin.hi. For now, I'll just comment out the admin.hi and we'll see if the user.hi works or not. So now refresh, you can see hello world. What if I try to do that on the admin.hi and I refresh the page? You can see admin.hi is not a function, so basically it's not defined. So in order to make it optional, so before the parenthesis and after the hi, I can add optional chaining like this to optionally call the function. If it exists on the user object, on the admin object, then call it. Otherwise, it will just return nothing. So you can see hello world over here, but we are not getting the error now. So here in both of the examples, we first use the dot. You can see the user.hi and then the admin.hi to get the hi function or property, because we assume that the user object exists, so it's safe to read from it. So that's why we are not adding the optional chaining over here. Then over here on the admin object, the optional chaining checks the left part, that is basically the hi. And if the hi function exists, then it returns the function for the admin object. Otherwise, evaluation stops without errors. We can also make use of the optional chaining with the delete operator. For example, if we want to delete a property from an object, we can use the same optional chaining with there in order to check if the property that we are deleting from the object do exist or not. So let's say, so I'll get rid of this code and I can simply do delete user dot, for example, name. So what it means is delete user.name if the user itself exists. We can use the optional chaining for separating and deleting, but it doesn't work for writing or adding new properties to an object because the optional chaining has no use on the left side of an assignment. So for example, if we are trying to do something like this, let's say we are doing optional chaining on this. If the user object exists, then add a name property to it and assign it somewhere, let's say job. When I save this and I refresh, you'll get an error for this. It says invalid left hand side in assignment. So we can use it for deleting the properties. We can use it for accessing properties. In those cases, it would work. But for the assignment, it won't work. So this is the end of the lecture, and I hope you have learned something new in this video. Please like and share the video, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to press the bell icon for further updates. And until then, I'll see you in the next lecture.